brothers, sisters, and friends, and welcome to You Are the Current Resident podcast. This is the official podcast of the National Association of Letter Carriers, the union that represents 280,000 active and retired city letter carriers employed by the United States Postal Service. I'm Ed Morgan. I'm in mourning. My Phillies really went in the tank there, and I asked Sarah, our producer, if we had taps to play, but we are on Zoom today. And as always, we have our national president, Brian Renfro, with us. Hey, Brian, how are you?
Hey, Eddie, I'm doing great. I can empathize with you over the baseball loss, as you know. I guess we should be good sports and congratulate our fine folks, at least in some parts of Texas, on the Rangers' victory. So Bruce Bochy does it again.
Yeah, congratulations, guys. So where were you this week?
This week had our 15th of our 15 regional training. So each one of our regions every year does at least one. Some do multiple, but a multi-day training for the folks from the branches within their regions. And our folks out in the Pacific Northwest and Region 2 had their training in Idaho. So was fortunate to be able to be there with them this week, and they had a great week of training, and then spent several hours with them just updating them on different things that are going on and answering their questions. So always good to be with our brothers and sisters out there. So we've concluded those for the year, and we'll start back in February for 2024.
Terrific. And where are you broadcasting from today?
Yeah, I am in San Francisco. It's Friday, November the 3rd, I think. And we've got this evening, we've got another one of our Enough is Enough crime rallies we're doing with Branch 214 here in San Francisco. So excited to do that. President Karen Escobar has done a great job of getting things organized there. We had another one in the Bay Area 2 or 3 weeks ago over in Branch 1111 in Oakland. And it's one of the places that we've really started to see our efforts, I think, begin to make a difference. We've seen the U.S. Attorney's Office here has started to prioritize, prosecuting these cases. We've talked about how that's a really important part of the solution here is ensuring that the cases are prosecuted. And I guess with those U.S. Attorney's offices, the way you can sometimes tell that they're prioritizing things is when they have a press conference about it. So they had a press conference and announced a number of arrests. And we've actually had some postal inspectors that have come out in support when we've done that event here in the Bay Area previously. So we're excited about doing that later this afternoon. I know we'll have a lot of members from Branch 214 and probably some from the surrounding branches there. And then on Monday, November the 6th, we have another rally scheduled. We'll get some good media coverage in Detroit. So working to continue to increase that public awareness through holding these events and getting the media to cover them. I think our listeners hopefully have seen, not just in these locations, but every single day there's ranging from national news outlets to local news outlets. We're seeing more and more and more coverage of the issue. The Postal Service last week had a national media event, a webinar to update the media on some of the things that they were doing, like the inspection services project, safe delivery. They've shifted their focus somewhat in a positive way, in my view, to, adding more resources into protection of employees. So things like offering larger rewards. They, I think, publicly committed to a larger number of, fairly immediate replacements for things like the way we access mail, using a technology solution to devalue that. So, we said from the beginning, this is a type of issue that unfortunately there's not a quick fix to, but I think our efforts are beginning to pay off. We're seeing some progress being made. So we'll continue to do what we can do through these type of events to get the word out and raise that public awareness and, put some good appropriate pressure on folks like the U.S. Attorney's offices. And as we've talked about before, we are actively working with friends in Congress to get a piece of legislation introduced that'll go a long way towards continuing our efforts. So kind of stay tuned for news there. We're hopeful to get that bill ready to go here sometime before the end of the year. And once we get that out, then we'll have some big plans nationwide to kind of quickly build support for that and continue, what really, aside from collective bargaining, which is always our number one priority, this increase in crime and the health and safety of our members is, right up there with collective bargaining as our top priority. So excited to be here in the Bay Area and excited to be with our brothers and sisters in the Detroit area on Monday. And we will continue our work until we are able to finally curb this increase and make the job safer.
That's great to hear. So in today's podcast, we're going to be talking about the Postal Record. We have a special guest coming up a little bit later. Rod, what are your thoughts about the Postal Record?
I mean, our members, I think, are familiar, hopefully, with the Postal Record. It comes in your mailbox monthly, and, it's also available online. People probably read it on the website. I would suspect if you're listening to this podcast, you've seen in this very same podcast feed, we put an audio version of the magazine up every month. But there's a lot of history with this magazine that I would guess that a lot of people don't know. And for example, it is the longest running publication in labor. There are lots of unions that have their own magazines. There are other publications that cover labor news and things like that. And the Postal Record actually predates the union. It's been around, NALC's been around since 1889, and the Postal Record has been around longer than that. So we thought it would be really good to have one of our communications staffers on. His name is Mike Shay. He's the managing editor of the Postal Record. He's been with NALC for over 20 years, I think. And Mike has done pretty much everything you can do when it comes to communications. He's done a lot of writing, obviously. He's done graphic design. He's done, work on the website. If you've been to NALC National Convention or a rap session or any type of event like that, you've probably seen him with a camera on one knee down in front of the people taking pictures. But Mike's going to give us a really interesting history of the magazine, and then we'll get into kind of how it's evolved over the years and some unique facts about it, and talk about, the process that we use currently to put the magazine together, which involves, Eddie, as you know, involves just really dozens of people at our headquarters. So it's a big part of the history of our union. And in many ways, it's the best resource for not just the present, but also the history of our union. And Michael, he's someone that is, while the magazine's really his responsibility now, his title is managing editor. He also takes, a pretty keen interest in that history. And, I think he'll share with our listeners a lot of really interesting information about the magazine, not just how it started, but how it's evolved over the years and what makes it unique among labor publications. So I think it'll be something that's both entertaining, I hope, and also should be really educational. I know there were a handful of things that I didn't even know that came up in our conversation. So we're excited to have Mike on today.
Yeah, that's one good thing that the union has here in headquarters is we have a lot of non-letter carrier staffers, and they're just really good at their job. I would say great at their job.
Yeah, and they, I often say they're not letter carriers, but they may as well be when it comes to, the knowledge that they've gained over the years and certainly their dedication towards, whatever their responsibilities are. That ranges from people we have at headquarters that work in communications to our finance department, to our membership department, to legislation and politics, you name it. We've got professionals that do a number of different things that are a huge part of what makes our union run and helps us be as effective as we can be. So it's really good to have somebody like Mike on that I think represents what our professional staff does really, really well. And here's my interview with the Postal Record managing editor, Mike Shay.
Hey, Brian.
Hey, Mike. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So before we get into what we're really here to talk about, and that's the history of the Postal Record and maybe a little bit about our communications as a union in general, you've been with NALC for a long time now. So why don't you just tell us a little bit about your history and maybe some of the things you've done leading up to what your current responsibilities are?
Sure, happy to. I've been at headquarters for 21 years now. I was hired to work on the Postal Record as the editorial assistant, basically the lowest person on the totem pole, and have just worked my way up since then. The great thing about NALC and the communications at headquarters is it's kind of a small group, so you really get a lot of opportunity to do a lot of different things, which is something that I've really enjoyed throughout the 21 years I've been here. Writing, editing, doing layout and design. I've helped out with the website, with doing the app, some of the other digital side, social media, even some of the podcasting. So it's really been a lot of fun working for headquarters, doing just about everything, and primarily working on the Postal Record.
Yeah, and for those listeners that have been delegates to a national convention, during the convention session, you probably have seen Mike like in all kinds of funny positions, kneeling around taking pictures. So, um, if you've never met him, then I'm sure you've seen him. Well, Mike, I think today it should be really interesting for our listeners to talk about our magazine, the Postal Record, and we'll start with its history and then kind of lead up to some of the things that are very unique about it in terms of publications from unions and other labor publications. But why don't we just start at the beginning? I guess how long the magazine's been around and maybe what the early years were like.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the great things about the Postal Record is its history. It began in 1887, which is actually 2 years before the union itself was organized. It was put together to publish, what they said about it was the Postal Record will publish everything of possible interest to postal employees and will, as in the past, advocate justice and fairness to these faithful servants of the American public. There was a real interest to get information about postal employees and specifically about letter carriers out there and to start communicating with each other as letter carriers became a real solid professional craft. And once the Postal Record started, it helped foster the ideas and bring together the people who were going to form NALC itself. And so when NALC was organized in 1889, 2 years later, the secretary of NALC personally bought the Postal Record and owned it himself. And in 1893, it was taken over by the union itself and became the official publication of NALC.
Whenever, I suppose, when you have a publication 2 years before the organization becomes an official organization, then you're off to a pretty good start. And, by and large, what you kind of quoted there as the original intent of the magazine, in large part, remains the intent. But there were a couple of things that I thought were particularly interesting that may be worth talking about that would be of interest to our listeners. Why don't you tell us about Raffles and the son of Raffles?
Sure. So the early publications, the early editions of the magazine, they didn't really have a cover. It was just sort of a plain cover. And then along in 1907, it began to have the same cover, which was of an illustration of a letter carrier. And it was just the monthly journal of the National Association of Letter Carriers. And the illustration of the letter carrier, he was on there for 31 years, the same exact one. And so he was nicknamed Raffles. And then in 1938, when they changed the illustration to more reflect what was going on in the 1930s with a letter carrier in a new uniform, they had a new illustration of a letter carrier. And so they needed a nickname for him. So they nicknamed him Son of Raffles. He didn't last quite as long as Raffles did, because by 1942, the cover started changing on a monthly basis with photos and illustrations to reflect what was actually in that issue.
So I guess these days we would be on like great grandson of Raffles. That might be a good contest idea.
Well, grandson, granddaughter, multiple people, the letter carriers have really changed to reflect America. And, I think the Postal Record has changed to reflect that as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So for a publication that's been around for over 135 years now, there's been a lot of history that's happened over that period of time. And, just thinking about the major events that have happened since it's been in publication, the two world wars, and then obviously in our world, the 1970 Wildcat strike and that period of time, I'm sure, all of these historic events that the Postal Record itself has had some highlights and probably had some interesting things take place as those important events in both our history as well as the larger history have played out. So why don't you maybe just talk to us a little bit about some of the things that have taken place with the magazine, with the publication during those important historic events?
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of the early Postal Records, because we were before collective bargaining, a lot of what were in those Postal Records were lengthy congressional transcripts of postal bills that would come up because letter carriers would have to lobby to get changes in their pay, to get changes in their benefits, to get annual leave, to get sick leave, to get any benefit, anything like that, you had to go and you had to petition Congress and had to get an act of Congress to actually do it. So there were quite a lot of transcripts of conference, of committee notes, of committee hearings, things like that. But when the big events would come along in the nation's history, the letter carriers would respond to it, and they would reference it in ways. And so when the U.S. entered World War I in 1917, the president at the time, Edward Gaynor, used the pages of the magazine to connect letter carriers to their role in the war effort. 18 years later, when America went into World War II, things were different. NALC had to postpone their 1945 convention. So the union president at the time, William Doherty, he leaned heavily on the Postal Record to keep members informed about what was going on. And then once the war did end, to suddenly scramble to put together a national convention as soon as possible once it had ended. So really, you can see how the history of America sort of is reflected in the pages of the magazine. When it came to the Wildcat strike, it was a bit different because the strike came from the members and not the leadership. And so the magazine at the time, the President James Rademacher, he was trying to lead the national organization, keeping the leaders of the organization from being jailed, to keep the publication, to keep the union from being taken over by the U.S. government. And so he really was walking this knife's edge of trying to talk about the strike without coming out and formally endorsing the strike. And so it's really reflected in those 1970 postal records, where letter carriers are writing in and they're publishing newspaper transcripts and things like that to really talk about what was going on with the strike, but also maintain what the NALC National needed to say in order to be able to stay in existence while this strike was going on, and really fighting the President Richard Nixon at the time.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I, had the really joy to get to know President Rademacher a little bit before he passed away a few years ago. And I specifically remember one conversation with him about the magazine. That was and still remains a primary means of communication, for us with our members. But at that particular time, it was really the primary means of communication. And this is reflected in some of the videos that we've done on the history of the strike, but he described exactly what you said, having to, through that communication, balance the things that he had to do in terms of protecting the leadership. But, he also certainly recognized the reasons for the strike and what could potentially come. So that was quite an interesting thing to hear him. And anyone that, had the opportunity to know him, he was he was very descriptive when it came to things like that. Okay, let's talk about the way the magazine is prepared itself. And as anything in this industry over the years, that's definitely evolved into a pretty smooth and professional operation today. But that wasn't always the case. So why don't we start with the way the magazine was prepared in years past? Then we may talk in detail about what you guys in our communications department do right now to put it all together. But let's start with some history and what that was like before we had all the comforts of modern technology and those type things.
So it's interesting that you mention it, because President Rademacher, when he was Secretary Treasurer, he was personally editing the magazine. So he did most of it himself. And when he became president, he took the magazine with him up to the president's purview. And when I was talking to him, when he was getting his 75-year pin at headquarters, what he said was he remembers laying out the magazine itself on the conference room in the president's office. And at the time, the way you would lay out things was you would take printouts of typed sheets, run them through what was known as a waxer, which would apply a layer of hot wax on the back of it. And you would actually push it down onto the boards, which would be photographed, and that would become the magazine page. So you can imagine the president of the union sitting there in the president's office, actually running things through wax and pasting it onto boards. That's how he personally put together the magazine. When Vince Sombrado came in the 80s, he decided to do things differently. He wanted to modernize things. And so he hired professional staff. He hired an editor, he hired a writer, he hired an editorial assistant. And at the time, they handled most of the editing, most of the writing, but the design and layout would be sent to an outside company to do it. Eventually, that was brought in-house so that the editors, the writers would go ahead and do the layout themselves. And what that did was it really saved the union a lot of money in terms of hiring an outside organization to do it. And over the years, it's also allowed the organization to have a lot of liberty, a lot of freedom, a lot of flexibility to go ahead and take care of other publications as well. So though we do the Postal Record, also what comes through our suite is things like the NALC Bulletin, the Activist, the JCAM, the Letter Carrier Resource Guide. Basically, anything that goes to print is usually taken care of in-house so that we can do it faster and more flexibly to allow the letter carrier staff and officers to go ahead and make changes very quickly and to move those publications along very quickly. And it's something that the union has been very good at ever since, about the 1980s.
Yeah, as fun as waxed pages and things like that sound, I think I'll stick to to reading my PDFs. And I mean, this is also emblematic. I mean, this happened in a number of different areas, but President Sombrado's vision for so many different things, including, our communications and the Postal Record, that he was so transformational in many, many, many ways. So let's talk about kind of our modern process. It's ongoing effort that really never ends. It's almost like we finish the magazine and for 1 month, and sometimes literally the next day we begin, you guys begin well in advance of that next day. But in terms of what our process is, why don't you kind of walk us through that from when we have the meeting where we kind of decide what the content will be generally to when we finally get those last pages off to the printer to print?
Yeah, absolutely. So the important thing that I should note so that I don't get thrown out of my office once I get back there. It's not just myself. We have 2 writer editors, Janessa and Rick, who do an amazing job of working on the Postal Record. We have Phil Dine, who handles the media relations, and he takes a hand in the Postal Record as well. And we also have the digital side who help us out quite a bit. So Madeline and Sarah do an amazing job on the digital side, but also sometimes help us out either getting sources, getting information for us, and then also on the other end of putting some of the stuff that we do in the magazine out digitally. So I needed to mention them. But the way it works is we start by pitching ideas for stories and the cover concept to you, the president, as well as the executive vice president, other chief letter carrier and professional staff, really to get a handle on what's going on in the union this month, what we want to promote. But like the organization, it's so broad. There's so much going on. It's usually not just one thing. So, we need to talk about what's going on with retirees. We need to talk about what's going on with the state associations. We need to talk about what's going on legislatively. We need to talk about what's going on with crime. We need to talk about what's going on with our community service programs. So we really try to reach out to all aspects of the organization to find out what's going on. And one of the nice things is while we're writing and editing the stories that are going up front, all of the officers, a number of letter carrier and professional staff submit columns to us to do some of the writing. And so that really brings in a lot of the news about what's going on in various parts of the organization. And once they come in, we go ahead and we edit those, we lay them out. We also get information from out in the field. So the branches, the state association, some retirees, NALC, the auxiliary, they all submit items to the Postal Record, which we then edit and lay out. And so that's really what we're working on for a good chunk of any given month. Once it's all ready, once we've finished writing, editing, laying it all out, getting it all ready, we send it to our union printers who go ahead and print it and then start mailing it out across the country. Meanwhile, we're preparing the PDFs to go online. We even record many of the stories and columns for the audiobook version that appears on the same channel. And then, once we're done with that, we go ahead and we got to do it again next month.
Yeah, it starts over or continues, I should say, real quickly. And I'm glad you mentioned the various staff that we have. And we've got, from the folks that you mentioned that are in our communications department, that this is really their primary responsibility and function in their job. But I would, off the top of my head, guess if we just simply counted the number of employees at headquarters, from officers to our letter carrier staff to our professional staff, I mean, there's literally dozens of people that are involved and contribute in some way to what we put together every month.
Oh, absolutely. And we couldn't do it without them.
Yeah, oh, trust me, they make my life a lot easier, as you know. So the Postal Record is a monthly publication and been that way for a long time. Most unions have some type of publication, but why don't you maybe just tell us in a few ways of how the Postal Record as a publication differs or kind of sets itself apart in some ways from other labor publications that are out there.
So we had talked briefly about the history of the Postal Record. And one of the striking things about the history of it is we are the oldest continuing published union publication in the country. But we're not just that, we're one of the oldest magazines in the country. We were started the same year as National Geographic, which is, one of the oldest publications still ongoing in the United States. There's only a couple of others that I know that are older. I think Scientific American, maybe Harper's is older than us. So we've been going for a really long time. So that's one way we set us apart. But within the labor community, I run into labor leaders all the time, and they talk about the Postal Record and they talk about the unique way it is, because inscribed in the NALC Constitution is the right for branches and state associations to submit items to the magazine. And that is something that you don't see in a lot of other organizations. They don't allow their locals to communicate that way, to really allow them to write whatever they want. And in the Constitution, it's, there's certain limits on it. It's got to be 300 words. The scribe, in some branches, the scribe is an elected post, but in most of them, they're appointed by the branch president. And they have to go through legal check just to make sure that we're not going to get sued for libel. But allowing the branches to submit is something that's been part of the Postal Record's DNA from the very beginning. If you look at those early issues, really letter carriers from around the country were submitting items. And it was an opportunity for letter carriers to communicate with other letter carriers about what was going on in their regions, in their cities, in their branches, but also so that they could get an idea of what was going on nationally. Because during the 1880s, communication wasn't traveling across the country the way it is now. And so it was a real opportunity for letter carriers to communicate with each other. And that's something that stayed with it ever since then. And it's something that you don't see in a lot of other publications. And it's something that NALC should be really proud of within the Postal Record.
Absolutely. And we, as you said, it's in our Constitution, and our branches and state associations submit items, and they can essentially, subject to a very few limits that are also provided in the Constitution, they can basically say whatever they want. And the result is that the magazine, to any NALC member, when they read it, they, of course, get views and information from headquarters, but also I think that perspective that they get from reading about what's going on in different parts of the country is really valuable. But beyond just simply the informational aspect of reading what our branches and state associations say, there's also, I think, a very functional use of the magazine for those branches and state associations. And constitutionally, our branches have an obligation to publish things like election notices and that type stuff. And the Postal Record also gives them a method or a mechanism to do that. So why don't you talk about that a little bit, where they send us information, and because it goes out to every member, it results in a very cost-effective means for branches to send out stuff like election notices.
Both in our Constitution and according to the Department of Labor, there are certain regulations about how branches, state associations, and even the national union has to conduct elections. And where it comes into play with the Postal Record is in the submitting notices for election and nomination. We do it prior to the election of officers. We are required to submit a notice of nomination and election. within the magazine within certain time limits in order to do that legally. The same thing applies for states and branches. And one of the things that we find a lot is when branches change officers, especially the secretaries or the secretary treasurers, one of their requirements is to submit election notices, notices of nomination, and they don't always remember the regulations and the rules for doing that. Every branch that is going to have an election must do it within a certain amount of time and must do it by mail to the individual members of their branch. That can be a financial hardship for a lot of branches. Mailing, as we know, is not cheap. The postal record, because it is already going to every member of the union and so every member of their branch, is a place that they can submit election notices, notices of nominations within the magazine to cover the requirements for their elections, to cover those requirements both for the Constitution as well as for the Department of Labor. And so we try to help out secretary treasurers whenever they need to do this. We tell them about the deadlines, point them to the Constitution where the deadlines are, and just ask that they submit them by the 10th of the month in order to get them in time, and really help them out whenever we can. Because, I've talked to a few secretary treasurers who try to submit something after the deadline when they won't make their deadlines. And suddenly they're looking at having to do a mailing and they're looking at the cost of it and the hardship of doing it. And they promise me next time they will get it in time.
Yeah. So you mentioned this a little bit earlier, but we all know, particularly those that are listening to this podcast, that communications in our daily lives have really evolved over the years. And, with the internet coming along, however many years ago that was, then social media and podcasts and videos. And so while the Postal Record remains a monthly publication, we have really made an effort to, make that content available in a number of different ways. So why don't you just talk to us a little bit about the evolution of communications in general, and then maybe more specifically about how we deliver the Postal Record, the magazine, the content in the magazine, the evolution of the ways that we deliver that and make that available to our members.
So, like we were talking about, the history of the Postal Record, it was a communication tool that existed prior to the Union, and it's built into the Union's Constitution. We talked about election notices, that information, but it's also built in for allowing branches to communicate, things like that. So it's really part of the DNA of NALC. But the Union's communications has evolved with the times. And then NALC has had to evolve with it. So, we do the activist publication for branch activists. We do the NALC bulletin to go into stations. Around the 1990s, we started doing the NALC website. Social media came along and we started to have a presence there. We wanted to take advantage of smartphones being in people's hands. So we got involved with the app. And then, of course, the podcast to really take advantage of people's ability to listen while doing other things. But even as we've added other tools, it's not like they replace the tools that existed before. It's more that the members now have more choices about how they get information. I mean, we see that outside of NALC with the many, many ways that Americans get information. They get it, on TV, they get it in newspapers, they get it online, they get it through the mail. And what we've seen is the mail is a great way to get information out. We've seen surveys done, we've seen studies done. I've spoken to letter carriers recently about the amount of political mail they're carrying right now and how it just is absolutely insane, the amount of it. And the reason that they do that, the reason that politicians put out political mail rather than doing it all online or whatever, is because people actually have to look at mail before getting rid of it, And so what they found through these studies, through these surveys, is that people engage with their mail more than just about any other communication. And so it's something that politicians have found is useful to them and why they continue to do political mail. And so we've seen that as well. And so that's why we continue to do print publications that go through the mail to members, because it engages them in a way that's different than some others. But some members prefer online engagement, and that's fine. It's just we as an organization have to figure out where to put our resources in order to reach as many members as possible. And one of the ways that we do that is by using the information from the magazine and in the other communication channels that we use. So we'll put together information for the Postal Record and we'll prepare that. And then we'll use smaller bite-sized versions of it in the NALC bulletin so that we can get it into the stations. We'll turn it into PDFs and we'll put it all up on the website so that members can get it there if they want. We put selective articles on columns and we shoot them out through social media or the app. As many of the podcast listeners probably know, we record a number of articles from the Postal Record and record them and put out an audiobook version. So we're really trying to use the information that we have and trying to reach as many members as we can. And we're using different tools to get it because members like different tools.
Yeah, and we obviously maintain an archive going back a long, long time. And in the somewhat recent history is available there on the website. You can, go back and look over the last few years or so. But Mike, in the event someone maybe remembers an article from a long, long time ago, or, is curious about something in the past, I guess there's no 100% guarantee, but the vast majority of the time, if they were interested in getting that in some type of digital format or copy or otherwise, they can always call headquarters, and usually we're able to help them out with that, right?
Right. So we have the digital archive online, I think going back to about 2010. Before that, I have the internal digital files going back until about 1995 or so. And we always have the hard copies. So we have the actual Postal Record hard copy magazines going all the way back to the beginning of the Postal Record and certainly the beginning of the NALC. So we get phone calls, from people saying, hey, I was in this article in the Postal Record in 1987. And, is there any way to get a copy or to get a photocopy of it? And we say, yeah. The more specific you can be about the date of the publication, that really helps. Sometimes I get someone who says, yeah, I was looking for an article from the 1970s. I forget which issue it was in. I forget what the headline was. Do you think you can find it? And we say, we'll look, and sometimes we find it and, sometimes we don't. But if we do our due diligence to try and find things for members, our purpose is to communicate and to serve the membership. We're really lucky in that regard that we get to work for the members and serve the members and communicate to the members because they do an amazing job and we get to support them. So anything that we can do, we will certainly give it our best effort.
Yeah, just as we're recording this the week of, I guess, October 30th. Just yesterday, I was out with our folks from Region 2 who are having their annual regional training. I was there with them yesterday in Idaho. A member came up to me and told me that her daughter was writing a research paper of some type on a lot of NALC history. And, obviously I pointed her to Carriers in a Common Cause. And she asked about a couple of different events that have happened over history. And like with the strike, I said, sure, we can, connect her with some of our members that were involved in the strike. And I said, we also have postal records going back to, forever. And she was kind of blown away by that. So, whether it's something as simple as that, or often there's branches that do maybe projects on their own history. And, there may be someone that remembers something that was in a magazine from their branch or about their branch years ago. And for anyone that's interested in that type stuff, we will definitely do everything we possibly can to find, if we can, whatever it is that you're asking for and get it to you. All right. So, Mike, you've worked on the Postal Record now, as you said, for over 20 years. As this is specific to you personally, but just thinking back on hundreds at this point of issues that you have worked on, thousands actually. Is there any articles or anything that you've worked on in particular that stands out to you that were, some of your personal favorites?
I feel really lucky. You talked about the history of the Postal Record, that it really dates back and it covers the Postal Record, covers the history of letter carriers of the Postal Service through much of our history. And it's an amazing tool to have. And I'm a bit of a history buff. So, some of my favorite articles are the history ones. I got lucky to do an article just in July on the zip code turning 60. So one of the editors at our magazine suggested doing an article about it. And I thought, okay, yeah, it'll be fun. We'll do a little thing about Mr. Zip and, some of the catchy logos, jingles, and things like that the Postal Service used to get people to switch over to the zip code. And that is fun and it is interesting. But as we got to dig more into it, we saw that the reason the Postal Service pushed so hard for people to switch to using the zip code was because it was on the cusp of changing the way mail was being routed. So prior to the zip code 60 years ago, every single envelope had to be looked at by a human pair of eyes. They had to be able to determine where it was going to. And what happened was the Postal Service was at the forefront of digitalizing communication, of being able to scan a code of 5 digits to be able to then mechanically forward the mail to any location. And God knows, as letter carriers know, the Postal Service is hardly perfect at it now, much less 60 years ago. But it was a changing point for the Postal Service. It was a changing point for letter carriers. It was a changing point for American business. And it was a changing point for America itself. If you look at how the country is studied today, it's often broken up into smaller bites by zip code or by city or whatever it is. And all of that really began with the Postal Service. And I was lucky when I was working on that article to really dig in and be able to see that, and found that it was such an interesting turning point in history and got to write an article about it. Another one that I really, really feel lucky that I got to work on was the article about Victor Green. So he was a letter carrier from New York who in the 1910s and 20s started a little travel guide known as the Green Book. And it was for Black Americans to travel safely through Jim Crow America. We were working on this, somebody just came in and said, hey, do we know anything about this? And we didn't know anything about it. And so started doing the research. And as we were doing it, after we put out the magazine article about it and about Victor Green and the important work he did, suddenly there was a movie about it that won an Academy Award. Suddenly there were stories about it everywhere. And people were really recognizing the accomplishment that this letter carrier had done. And it's always been telling to me that whenever we've seen articles about it, they always talk about the Green Book, but they never talk about the letter carrier at the center of it. And that was really important, I think, for us to recognize that there was a human being at the center of it, what his motivation was, the work that he did in order to accomplish this thing. And I feel really lucky that we got to tell that story to the letter carriers, to remind them, the work that they do both in the Postal Service, but also what they do outside of the Postal Service. It can be of vital importance.
Yeah, those are both excellent examples. And the Green Book is something that if anyone's not familiar with that story, I'd encourage you to, read up on it. And we often, through the series that we do currently of letter carriers that have interesting hobbies ranging from, things that people just do for fun to the Green Book and what Brother Green did years ago is really an incredible thing that had an impact on so many people. That's one of the things that we really like to do is, certainly report news and things like that, but definitely highlight and recognize the unbelievable, really, contributions that, our members have made, not just to the union or not just to the Postal Service, but to really society and our world in general.
We tell so much contractually, and that's important in the Postal Record, and I'm proud of the breadth and width that we do of that. But also what I love is that you and the organization have given us the license to recognize the letter carriers, because that's something that sometimes we forget is there are people living out these contracts, and to really bring that people side. We talk about the diversity of letter carriers of the union, and it's a great way to see it. Even if we're talking about, somebody who makes horseradish or somebody in a band or, somebody who makes model ships, the ships that they served on during the Vietnam War, whatever it is, we're reminding letter carriers that you're not just your uniform. There are people in those uniforms, and what you do is important, and you represent the entire country. And that's the great thing about our organization is we have letter carriers from everywhere in the country, from all walks of life. And like I said, it's really lucky that we get to do in the Postal Record, and I feel really glad to have been able to do this with my career to work for letter carriers.
For our listeners, every month when we have this meeting to go over what the content for the magazine will be next month, it never fails that when I see the plan or the idea for the story where we just highlight one of our members and one of their interesting hobbies, I'm just blown away by the talent that our members have for doing all sorts of things. I mean, as our listeners at letter carriers know, not everyone can case and deliver mail. And it's pretty clear that those that can do that quite often have, a lot of times very unique talents. Also, the fact that what letter carriers do is we love to serve our customers, and that translates into activities off the job, so to speak, too. So I could not agree with you more. I guess, Mike, the last thing I want to ask you is we mail this magazine to all our active and retired members, it fluctuates a little bit, but somewhere just south of 300,000. And, as well as other people, there are a lot of other folks that read the magazine as well. So we maintain a database with those addresses and all that stuff. So if anybody is listening that's a member and, whether they've recently moved or for whatever reason they're not getting their magazine, why don't you tell them the things that they can do to be sure that we get their right address and ensure that they receive their magazine in the mail?
Yeah, absolutely. So on the website is the members only section. If you can go and you can log into there, you'll be able to see the address that NALC has for you on record. And that's where we send the postal record. What you can also do is contact the NALC membership department by phone. They will confirm your address or go ahead and change your address. One of the interesting problems we sometimes have is with snowbirds, letter carriers who live in one location for the summer and then move somewhere else for the winter. And really what we need is for them to contact the NALC one way or the other, to let them know about changing their address, because all too often they'll move and the postal record won't get forwarded. So it will bounce back to headquarters and we'll think that it's not supposed to go to that address anymore. And so we'll hold on to it until the member contacts the NALC. So if for some reason you're not receiving the postal record, whether you're a snowbird or, any kind of bird, go ahead and contact the NALC or go into the members only section. Let us know your current address. Let us know you're not receiving the postal record, and we'll go ahead and get that fixed for you.
Very good. Well, Mike, I really appreciate you taking some time to join us. I think this conversation will be probably educational in a lot of ways and hopefully of interest to our listeners. And I just want to finally echo a little bit of what you said earlier. On previous episodes of this podcast, we've had a variety of officers and letter carrier staff and our professional staff. And I think aside from mentioning Sarah and Madeline, who produced and edit this podcast and, all that stuff, I just want to recognize you and all our folks that work in our communications department to work on things like the Postal Record and the website and the bulletin and really anything you see come from NALC in print form or on the website or audio or video. I've said this on this podcast before, but it definitely remains true that a lot of the professional staff that we have in our building, they are all not letter carriers, but they may as well be when it comes to their level of understanding and dedication and commitment to our members. And you are someone, you've been at NALC headquarters longer than I have and have been there since the first day I was there. And you've always done an outstanding job in whatever you were doing at the time. And that continues with the Postal Record. So we appreciate you and appreciate you taking some time to join us.
Well, thank you. Thank you for letting me do this.
All right, this is the Ask the Mailbag segment, and our first question comes from Stephen Geyer. He's from Bell City Branch 436 in Racine, Wisconsin. He realized this may vary from contract to contract, but when we go to interest arbitration, is the whole contract usually up for arbitration or only parts that are still being negotiated?
Yeah, Stephen, really good question. So I guess the best way to answer is, well, first, I'll say no, the whole contract does not, at least historically speaking, go to interest arbitration. So it's not if anybody's listening has been involved in, I guess the closest thing that we would have to our national interest arbitration would be what we do, every contract with our local memorandums of understanding, where kind of if you open it up, the whole thing's open. Interest arbitration doesn't really work like that. So what happens is, just process-wise, we select a neutral arbitrator. There's a panel of arbitrators, 3 arbitrators. There's the neutral, who ultimately makes a decision, and then both the union and management will also appoint an arbitrator. And their role is just to be sure that the interest of both parties is very clearly understood. When we begin the process of interest arbitration, both parties will submit an official proposal of, normally the center point is economic issues, things like pay, benefits, often the structure of the workforce, anything like that that has a significant financial impact on the Postal Service and on our members. Because those are, look, there's a lot of things in our collective bargaining agreement that are important, work rule wise, but the pay and benefits of letter carriers is always the most important, because when it really boils down to it, that's the reason we all go to work, is because to make a living and the benefits that we get for ourselves and our family. So that's usually the centerpiece of it. Now, it's not always just limited to that. There is often, if you look throughout, the history of our interest arbitration, and possibly even this time, if we end up there, which we'll know the answer to that question very soon, sometimes there may be an additional issue or two that is non-economic in nature. So what normally happens, and if we indeed end up in interest arbitration in this round of contract negotiations, is over the negotiations process, there are usually hundreds of issues that the parties have negotiated over. And we normally, as we do right now, will have what we call tentative agreement on a lot of different things. And if we reach an impasse, which means we don't agree on one or more big issues that it would take in order for us to reach an agreement on the entire contract, we still have a lot of stuff where we have reached agreement. That is the case this time. So when we enter into that process, once we declare an impasse, there will be a lot of stuff that the parties will agree we've already reached agreement on, and this will be part of this next collective bargaining agreement, regardless of the outcome of the interest arbitration process. So there'll be, a number of things that we will submit really to the arbitration panel and say, hey, we've already agreed on this stuff. This would be a part of your award. And then each party will identify the issues that we want to bring forward to the panel. There's also I'm not going to get too deep into this, but there is certainly a strategic approach when it comes to what you put on the table. So if you put every single thing, your entire wish list on the table, you run the risk of not being able to really prioritize what's most important. So, for example, for us, pay, benefits, the things that have a direct financial impact on our members are always going to be number one. They're going to be the most important. And that is something that in both a proposal as well as the case that we would put on, we're going to make very clear. So we do not want there to be any confusion over what our primary objectives are in any round of interest arbitration. And that's been true historically. If you look at the half a dozen or so times that we have utilized the interest arbitration process, and that will be true this time, should we end up in interest arbitration. So the answer is there'll be a lot of stuff that we've already agreed on, but then there will be the things that we have reached an impasse over or we do not agree on, which normally, and including this particular round of bargaining, should we end up in interest arbitration, are going to revolve around the economic issues. Like I said, things like pay, benefits, the structure of the workforce. We currently have CCAs, a non-career category of employees. What we want to do with that category of employees in terms of whether that's eliminating them or transitioning them to career, whatever, the case may be. So each party will sit down together. We'll figure out the things that we already agree on. There will be a lot of that. And then it's usually just pretty evident, the issues that we don't agree on, that we would put in front of the panel itself. So in a nutshell, that's kind of how it works. And in this round of bargaining, should we end up in interest arbitration, which once again, we're going to know the answer to that question pretty soon here, there will be an official proposal, and that will be communicated to the members. So the folks that are members of our union that would be affected by whatever the outcome of a potential interest arbitration proceeding will be, they will be aware of what our proposal is, which obviously will identify the issues where we don't have agreement and things that through that process we're seeking to achieve.
Great. Our next question comes from Camilla Howard. She's a carrier in branch 11. She appreciates the updates in the podcast. Mark that down. That's one for us, Brian.
All right. We got a fan.
Yep. She wants to know if a traumatic event happens with the employee and they suffer anxiety flare-ups from the continuous forms of violence and robberies, directly or indirectly, or are people with emotional disabilities protected under Workman's Comp Act? Would that be considered an underlying condition?
Okay, so the short answer is yes. The law, the Federal Employees Compensation Act, or FECA, as it's called for short, that lays out what is compensable by the Office of Workers' Compensation Programs, OWCP. Harm or injury from a traumatic event, even emotional, can be covered under the law. However, that is still subject to approval, and it's got to meet certain conditions. One in particular, there are basically two types of injuries that occur. One is called an injury from a traumatic event. So, something happens, an accident, for example, that results in an injury, a single event that happens within the course of a day. And that's one category. Another category is what we call occupational disease. So, something that happens over the course of more than one day, this is physical, but just to demonstrate what I'm talking about, something that's very common with letter carriers is like rotator cuff injuries, because, while we're casing mail, we're constantly moving our arm. So over a period of time, with some people that can result in a shoulder injury. The same can be true of, stress or any other type of injury that occurs as a result of the way you framed it, a traumatic incident such as these robberies and crimes. But the OWCP claims, in order to be approved, they require something where you have to demonstrate what's called a causal relationship, which is the injury and the fact that it was caused by something at work. So I'm really not going to go much deeper than that. I'll encourage you to, if you haven't listened already, to go back a couple of weeks. We had Kobe Jones on the podcast, who's in his title is Assistant to the President for Workers' Compensation. Kobe is really an expert on this type stuff. And in that episode, he laid out in great detail the way this stuff works, the way claims with OWCP, the way they play out, the things that we have to do to get them approved. NALC has a network of representation to assist our members with workers' compensation claims that is absolutely unmatched. No other union or employee organization even comes close to the level of representation that we provide. So I would strongly encourage you to go back and listen to that podcast. It was just a couple of weeks ago. And then, of course, you could always, call your national business agent's office. They'd be happy to help you out and either answer your questions or connect you with the appropriate person within that network that we have. I think we've got now 12 or 13 what we call regional workers' compensation assistants that are out there, as well as our folks at headquarters that work under our director of retired members, Dan Toth, that focus on workers' compensation issues. Really good question.
Our next question comes from North Jersey in branch 38, Kenny Crum. He's been enjoying the podcast. He finds it very informative. Since we have come into the political mail season, he was wondering if there's any way to place restrictions on the size of these particular mail pieces. Some days we have 2 or 3 separate mailings, and they're each the size of a medium pizza box.
Yeah, so first off, let me just acknowledge and recognize, and I'm sure Eddie would do the same, that, look, all letter carriers have experienced mail that is difficult to handle. That can be very frustrating, and you're absolutely right in that seems to be far more common during this time of year when we start to get election mail for a number of reasons. One is, as you mentioned, that sometimes the size and shape is a little abnormal. Their address lists or mailing lists are usually not terribly up to date. We see that a lot. So, all that does add up to a lot of frustration and difficulty sometimes when it comes to dealing with certain types of mail. But I think that there's a bigger picture thing here that we, have to remember. And while it's hard, while we're dealing with that frustration of, handling mail, the type that you described, everything that we put our hands on and deliver, a customer paid for that. And that is revenue to the Postal Service, and that is money that supports the Postal Service and therefore supports our jobs. So, it is literally true to say that even the frustrating mail pieces, such as election mail or, whatever else it may be, that supports our jobs and, supports the Postal Service from a revenue standpoint. And that's what pays us. So there are, I guess, certain things that probably with certain kinds of mail that could be done to, make them more efficient and easier to deliver and therefore make it more cost effective for the Postal Service. But, there's a fine line there. I mean, what we do not want to do is to put some sort of restrictions in place that result in a loss of revenue, because the Postal Service needs to have revenue. And the more revenue that the Postal Service has, the better shape they're in financially, which directly translates to things like their long-term sustainability, our job security, collective bargaining, and stuff like that. So while I want to clearly acknowledge and let look, I understand the frustration, as does every letter carrier. I think it's really important for us to remember that revenue that we get from those mail pieces, even the ones that are difficult to deal with and can cause a lot of frustration in the big picture, are positives for us in terms of supporting the Postal Service and our jobs.
I couldn't agree more. Kenny, like Bill Clinton once said, I feel your pain. Remember
Yep.
back to those days with the paper cuts, those mailings were like razors sometimes.
Yep.
All right. Our next question comes from Trevor Helgren. He's from Las Vegas, branch 2502. His mother-in-law asked him why we have such horrible schedules with rotating days off. I've often wondered the same thing over his last 23 years. Can you give us the history or the reason why our scheduled days off are the way they are?
Sure. So there are people that would fall on both sides of this issue. You mentioned a family member and rotating days off. There are others that, may have what we call a fixed day off, that, where their day off is Sunday and another day, possibly during the week. And given their preference, they would rather have a rotating day off. So recognizing that, for quite some time, we have, the union negotiated in years past, the ability for us to elect to have either fixed or rotating days off. Generally speaking, most larger, medium to larger size offices, not all, but most, have chosen to have rotating days off. Where we see fixed days off most of the time is in smaller offices where you may just have one or two carriers. But this is something that's covered in the local memorandum of understanding. It is normally the procedure that a branch would use, is that they would vote on, what the preference was in that particular work location. And, we're a very democratic union, small d democratic. Normally, once folks choose what they want to do, that is communicated to the Postal Service as a part of their local agreement, then they'll establish having either fixed or rotating days off. So, I don't know the specifics of your branch. I know your branch well, and I know your branch leadership well, and I would suspect that if the majority of members in your particular work location or in your installation had, a desire to make a change like that, then that would be something that could be discussed with the leadership in your branch and, possibly make that change. But normally these things, once they're established, it's pretty unusual to have someone decide to change. I mean, typically once the majority of carriers in a location decide that's, they want to have either fixed or rotating days off, because look, there's, merits to both of them. If you're in a small office and you get Saturday, Sunday, or Sunday, Monday as your days off, most people prefer that. If your fixed days off are going to be like Sunday and Wednesday or Sunday and Thursday, most people anyway would prefer rotating, because with rotating days off, you get a Friday, Saturday, Sunday, every 6 weeks. So it's really just a matter of preference, and our collective bargaining agreement provides the option, during that local implementation period for the union to, make that decision as to which type of non-scheduled day they want to use. So everyone has an opinion, and as I said, we have historically been that the majority rules, and I would encourage you, if you've got any questions about, that in your particular branch, talk to your shop steward, contact your branch officers, and, I'm sure they would be happy to talk to you about, what the history is and kind of how the decision was made at whatever point. Normally, it's just something that happened a long time ago that they decided to choose the schedule that they chose.
And that was our Ask the Mailbag segment. If you have a question, please email it to social@nalc.org. Thank you for listening to this episode of You Are the Current Resident. Please subscribe to the podcast so that you don't miss an episode. And please share the podcast with our NALC brothers and sisters. You can follow the NALC on social media on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Threads. You can find links to our accounts in the episode description, and you can follow President Renfro on Twitter at BrianRenfro19. If you have any questions to submit, have feedback about the podcast, again, email us at social@nalc.org. May your steward be by your side, and may your union have your back. Thanks for listening. See you next week.